In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Grove, where neat rows of houses line the streets, lived a white woman named Emma Thompson. Despite well-kept garden that adorned the front of her charming home, Emma was known for her meticulous nature and hostility towards people of color. Next door to Emma lived Mrs. Patterson, a beautiful black widow who was known for her eccentricity. Mrs. Patterson was an excellent cook, and her small kitchen often emitted delicious aromas that wafted through the neighborhood. The residents of Willow Grove had grown accustomed to the delightful smells that often beckoned them to Mrs. Patterson's door, where they were welcomed with a plate of her homemade treats. However, as the years passed, Emma found herself increasingly irritated by the constant scents emanating from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen. She felt that the rich fragrances wafting from Mrs. Patterson's house invaded her home and stirred up memories she preferred to keep buried. One warm summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma was sipping tea and contemplating the fragrant issue that had been bothering her for months. The aroma of Mrs. Patterson's latest culinary creation, spicy curry, hung in the air, causing Emma's annoyance to reach a tipping point. She marched into her house and dialed the number for the Willow Grove Police Department. As she waited for someone to answer, she rehearsed her complaint in her mind, focusing on the nuisance caused by Mrs. Patterson's cooking. Willow Grove Police Department, how may I help you? A calm voice answered on the other end. Yes, hello. This is Emma Thompson, and I'd like to report a disturbance. The dispatcher listened as Emma detailed her grievances, expressing how the smells from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen invaded her home, causing discomfort and distress. The dispatcher, accustomed to handling a variety of calls, assured Emma that they would look into the matter and send an officer to investigate. Within a short time, Officer Johnson, a seasoned and good-natured policeman, arrived at Willow Grove. He knocked on Emma's door, where she eagerly awaited his arrival. "Officer, it's unbearable. I can't enjoy my evenings in peace," Emma pleaded, telling her side of the story as she pointed to her neighbor's apartment. Officer Johnson listened attentively, jotting down notes in his pad. He assured Emma that he would speak to Mrs. Patterson and investigate the matter thoroughly. As he approached Mrs. Patterson's front door, the savory aroma of the evening's meal intensified. Mrs. Patterson, a pretty woman with black hair and a warm smile, greeted Officer Johnson. She invited him inside, unfazed by the situation. Mrs. Patterson offered Officer Johnson a plate, hoping to share the joy of her culinary expertise. However, Officer Johnson politely declined, expressing the need to address the concerns raised by Emma Thompson. Emma and Mrs. Patterson were both invited to the police station. Officer Johnson proposed they all talk about it amicably rather than escalating the issue, and they both agreed to meet out and talk about it. Mrs. Patterson, her eyes widening in surprise, glanced at Emma. "Oh, Emma, I had no idea. I'm just cooking the meals I've always made. It's never been a problem before. If it's bothering you, I can try to be more mindful," she said, her tone sincere. Emma, not entirely satisfied, insisted that the smells were more than a minor inconvenience. She emphasized how they stirred up memories and emotions that she preferred to keep buried. Officer Johnson, caught between two neighbors with conflicting perspectives, proposed a compromise. He suggested that Mrs. Patterson be mindful of the times she cooked certain dishes and perhaps take steps to mitigate the odors. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that there was more at play than just the smells from the kitchen. She despised Mrs. Patterson because she was black. But Mrs. Patterson, empathetic and understanding, offered a genuine apology. She even invited Emma to share a meal with her, hoping to bridge the gap between them. It was at this point Emma realized how hostile she's been towards her neighbor, and her stony heart began to melt at the way Mrs. Patterson apologized. It was settled amicably by the police, and they both left the police station individually. One sunny afternoon, Emma received a knock on her door. Opening it, she was surprised to find Mrs. Patterson standing there with a covered dish in her hands. Touched by the gesture, Emma invited Mrs. Patterson inside. The two women sat in Emma's cozy living room, sharing stories and laughter after the meal, and that bridged the gap between them. It was a pivotal moment, a breaking of bread that symbolized not only the acceptance of Mrs. Patterson's cooking but also the forging of an unexpected friendship. As the seasons changed, so did the dynamics of Willow Grove. Emma and Mrs. Patterson, once mere neighbors, became confidants. They discovered shared hobbies and interests, and Mrs. Patterson's inviting kitchen became a gathering place for the neighborhood. Word of the evolving relationship between Emma and Mrs. Patterson spread throughout Willow Grove, sparking a sense of community that hadn't been as palpable before. Neighbors began to host block parties, potlucks, and other events that brought everyone together. The once divided neighborhood now thrived on a newfound unity. One day, as Emma tended to her garden, she noticed a group of children playing in Mrs. Patterson's yard. The sound of laughter and joy filled the air, creating a harmonious backdrop to the fragrant scents wafting from the kitchen. Emma smiled, realizing that the source of her initial discomfort had become the catalyst for positive change in Willow Grove. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma received a call that jolted her from the tranquility she had come to cherish. Worry etched across her face, Emma rushed to the hospital. Mrs. Patterson had cancer all along and she had limited time to live. Days turned into weeks, and the hospital visits became a routine for Emma. The smells of the hospital, sterile and impersonal, replaced the comforting aromas of Mrs. Patterson's kitchen. Yet, in the face of adversity, the bond between Emma and Karen deepened. They became pillars of support for each other, finding strength in each other. One quiet afternoon, Mrs. Patterson peacefully passed away, leaving behind a legacy of love, unity, and the aroma of her cherished recipes. In the days that followed, Willow Grove came together once again, this time to celebrate the life of Mrs. Patterson. The neighborhood, once divided by a simple complaint, now stood united in honoring the woman who had brought them together. A community garden was planted in Mrs. Patterson's memory, where neighbors shared seeds, stories, and laughter. The once trivial dispute over the smell of food had blossomed into a narrative of love, friendship, and the enduring impact of shared experiences.